The smell of white oak is different when it's fresh from the planer. It's sweet, slightly sharp, and leaves a fine, pale dust that hangs in the air of my workshop like a golden mist when the afternoon sun hits the high windows. I was running my palm down the grain of a 7-foot dining table, checking for the slight, almost invisible ridges that a machine leaves behind, and only a hand can find, when the bell above the side door chimed. I didn't need to look up to know it was Maya. She walked with a quick, deliberate stride that always made the gravel outside slide beneath her boots. She didn't knock. She never had. Not in the 15 years we'd known each other, ever since we were 10 years old, and she had climbed over my back fence to escape her mother's classical piano drills. Today, she brought the smell of the autumn rain with her. Her dark hair was damp at the temples, tucked behind her ears, and she wore her usual field kit, a faded canvas jacket, mud-speckled boots, and a leather satchel that carried her environmental reports. "You're behind schedule on that table, Luke," she said, leaning her hip against the heavy timber of my assembly bench. "I'm not behind," I replied, my voice low and steady, matching the quiet of the shop. "The wood just hasn't finished telling me where it wants to be cut yet. There's a knot in the center that's stubborn." "Well, you've got 48 hours to finish negotiating with it," she said. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a heavy cream-colored card with gold-embossed lettering, and slid it across the dusty surface of the workbench. "Because I need to hire you." I stopped my hand on the wood. I looked at the card. It was an invitation to the wedding of her older sister, Vivian, at the Blackwood Estate, a high-end winery, in the valley where a bottle of Cabernet cost more than my monthly utility bill. "I don't do event planning, Maya," I said, a faint smile touching the corner of my mouth. "And last time I checked, your sister doesn't like me. She told me my truck was a local noise hazard when I dropped you off at her college graduation. Vivian doesn't like anyone who isn't currently listed on the stock exchange." Maya sighed, running a hand through her hair. She looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from weeks of fighting local zoning boards over soil degradation, only to have her own family treat her career like a temporary phase. But that's not the point. I don't need a woodworker. I need a date. "A date? A fake one," she corrected quickly, her eyes locking onto mine. "Specifically, a very convincing, very unshakable, fake date who will stand next to me while my mother spends 3 days dropping passive-aggressive hints about my single status and my noble but unprofitable career choice." I picked up the heavy invitation. The paper was thick, almost stiff enough to use as a scraper. "Your mother still thinks you're going to law school. She's currently telling the wedding coordinator that I'm taking a sabbatical to study the earth," Maya said, her voice dropping into a perfect, dry imitation of her mother's refined accent. "It sounds much better than my daughter spends her weeks in knee-high muck measuring nitrate levels in agricultural runoff." I looked at Maya, really looked at her. Beneath the dry wit and the familiar, easy banter, there was a quiet tension in her shoulders. Her family, the wealthy, old-money Estepone, had a way of treating her like a decorative piece that had somehow fallen off the display shelf. They didn't understand the work she did. More importantly, they didn't respect it. For years I had watched her return from family holidays looking like she had spent 3 days in a wind tunnel, her confidence battered, but her jaw set in that stubborn line I knew so well. "Why me?" I asked, setting the invitation down. "You have colleagues. You have guys from the agency who own jackets that don't smell like linseed oil, because those guys would try to impress them," Maya said softly. "They'd talk about their portfolios or their master's degrees, and my mother would dissect them in 5 minutes. But you don't care about their game, Luke. You never have. When Vivian's fiancé starts talking about his luxury development project, you won't flinch. I need someone who is solid, someone who knows who I am, so I don't forget it myself while I'm there." I leaned my back against the edge of the table, crossing my arms. And? The boundaries? Strict, she said immediately. No weirdness. We've been best friends since we were kids. We share the guest cabin at the vineyard, we eat the expensive food, we play the part, and on Sunday night, we drive back here. You go back to your oak, I go back to my marsh, no blurred lines. She paused, her eyes searching my face. Then she added one more thing. Just don't make it look too fake. My mother has an eye for weakness. If we don't look like we actually want to be in the same room together, she'll see through it before the first toast. I let the silence hang between us for a long moment. Outside, the rain began to tap harder against the metal roof of the shop. I looked at the white oak table. It could wait 3 days. Maya couldn't. All right, I said. I'll need to buy a suit. The only one I have is from my uncle's funeral 5 years ago, and I've gained 10 pounds of shoulder muscle since then. Maya's shoulders visibly dropped, the tension leaving her in one long, quiet breath. I'll pay for the suit, Luke. No, I said, my voice firm. If I'm playing the part of a successful, independent man who is crazy about you, I buy my own suit. That's the first rule. She looked at me, a small, genuine smile, finally breaking through her exhaustion. Deal, she said softly. The drive to the Blackwood estate took 3 hours. My truck, a 20-year-old diesel with a rebuilt transmission and a constant coat of mountain mud, didn't exactly fit the driveway. The road was lined with ancient, manicured cypress trees, their branches forming a dark canopy over a gravel lane, so smooth it felt like driving on velvet. Maya sat in the passenger seat, her knees pulled up to her chest, her fingers tracing the edge of a map on her tablet. She had traded her canvas jacket for a dark green wool coat, but she still wore her heavy silver ring, the one she had bought herself when she finished her first independent wetland survey. The vineyard is built on an alluvial fan, she murmured, her eyes on the screen. Great drainage for the grapes, but the local water table is incredibly shallow. If they keep using that synthetic pesticide on the upper slope, it's going to hit the creek by winter. I told the owner that 3 years ago, he told me he'd take it under advisement. Then he bought a yacht. Some people prefer the yacht to the creek, I said, keeping my eyes on the road. The creek is what keeps the soil alive, Luke. Without it, they're just growing sour grapes on life support. I know, I said. But you're not here as a consultant this weekend. Remember, you're here as Vivian's sister and my. I hesitated for a split second, testing the word on my tongue. Maya turned her head to look at me. In the dim light of the dashboard, her eyes were dark, reflective. How does it feel saying that? It feels fine, I said, keeping my voice steady. But I'm a woodworker, Maya. I don't build things that are hollow. If I'm going to say it, I have to mean it for the weekend. I need to know how we met, from their perspective. We met when we were 10, she said simply. They know that, but they want the story of how the childhood friend became the man who sleeps in your guest cabin. They want the moment the shift happened. Maya looked back out the window at the passing vines. Tell them the truth, then. Just change the timeline. What's the truth? That I was lost in the marsh 3 years ago during that late autumn survey. The radio went dead. The tide came in faster than the charts predicted, and my truck got stuck in the salt mud. Everyone at the office told me to wait for morning. But you didn't. I remembered that night. I hadn't even thought about it. I had just loaded my winch gear, my heavy tow straps, and 2 thermos jugs of hot coffee into the truck and driven 3 hours into the dark delta. When I found her, she was sitting on the roof of her cab, soaked to the waist, shivering but still holding her sample bags above the rising water. I remember, I said. You complained that the coffee was too sweet. It was, she said, a small laugh escaping her. You put 3 sugars in it, but it was hot. And when you pulled my truck out of the mud, You didn't tell me I was stupid for being out there alone. You just checked my tires, handed me a dry wool shirt, and told me to follow you back to the highway. That's because you weren't stupid, I said. You were just working. To my family, that was the night I proved I couldn't handle my life, Maya said quietly. If we tell them that was the night we realized we didn't want to walk through the dark alone anymore, they'll believe it, because it's almost true. I didn't answer. I just held the steering wheel, the heavy rumble of the diesel engine filling the cab as we pulled up to the grand stone gates of the estate. The main lodge of the Blackwood estate was a massive structure of rough-hewn timber and local fieldstone, designed to look like an old European manor, but with 60-foot glass walls that looked out over the illuminated vineyards. Valet parking, attendants in matching black vests, stood near a fountain that looked like it had been imported piece by piece from Tuscany. When I parked my truck next to a line of pristine luxury sedans, the young man at the valet podium looked at my muddy fenders like they were a personal insult. I'll park it myself, I said, rolling down the window and handing him a $20 bill before he could speak. She's got a temper, if you don't double clutch into reverse. The kid took the bill, his eyes widening slightly at my suit. I had chosen a charcoal wool three-piece. It wasn't flashy, but the tailor in town had spent 3 hours ensuring the shoulders had room for my frame and the trousers fell perfectly over my polished boots. It was a suit built for utility, but it fit like armor. Maya stepped out of the passenger side, her long dark green dress flowing around her ankles. She looked elegant, but she still carried her leather satchel instead of a designer purse. As we walked up the stone steps toward the grand entrance, she reached down and slid her fingers into mine. Her hand was cold, slightly tense. I didn't squeeze it too hard, but I kept my grip firm, steady, letting her feel the warmth of my palm. "You're doing great," I murmured. "I haven't even seen my mother yet," she whispered back. "That's why we're practicing now." The double doors opened into a high-ceilinged reception hall, filled with the clinking of crystal, the soft murmur of polite laughter, and the scent of expensive perfume and wood smoke. A massive stone fireplace dominated the room, its mantel decorated with white roses and trailing ivy. "Maya, you made it." The voice was sharp, perfectly modulated, and carried across the room like a silver bell. Helen Estepone moved through the crowd with the effortless grace of a woman who had spent 40 years organizing charity galas. Her silver hair was styled into a flawless bob, and her silk dress was the exact shade of pale lavender that suggested she was too busy to worry about spills. Beside her walked Vivian, the bride. Vivian looked like an older, more polished version of Maya, but her eyes were different, cooler, more calculating, her smile fixed in place like a coat of lacquer. "Mother Vivian," Maya said, her voice even as she stepped forward. Helen didn't hug Maya. She touched her cheeks with a dry, practiced gesture, her eyes immediately scanning Maya's dress, her hair, and her satchel. "Green, darling." "It's so organic," Helen said, her smile never fading. "And you brought the bag. Are we expecting a soil emergency during the rehearsal dinner?" "It has my notes for the toast, Mother," Maya said, her grip on my hand tightening slightly. Then Helen's eyes shifted to me. They narrowed, just for a fraction of a second, as she took in my height, my suit, and the hand that was still holding her daughter's. "And you must be Luke," Helen said, her tone softening into that polite, dangerous curiosity. "The craftsman? Maya told us you were coming, but we weren't sure if your schedule would allow you to leave the forest." "The shop is busy, Mrs. Estepone," I said, stepping forward and offering her my hand. My grip was firm, but not aggressive. My palm was dry, the skin rough from 20 years of working with wood, and I saw her notice the contrast immediately. But when Maya asks me to be somewhere, the wood has to wait. "It's a matter of priority." Helen's eyebrows rose slightly. She wasn't used to men who spoke so slowly or so directly. "How romantic, Vivian." "Dear, look at this." A man who baronetizes his appointments. It's nice, Vivian said, her eyes fixed on my suit. She looked at me like she was trying to find a price tag. Although Julian's friends are all in the gallery right now. They're discussing the new logistics hub. He's funding in the valley. You should join them, Luke. You might find some synergy. I'm not much for synergy, Vivian, I said, a faint, polite smile on my face. I find that if you build something right the first time, you don't need a lot of buzzwords to keep it standing. Maya let out a tiny, almost silent breath beside me. Her thumb brushed against the back of my hand. Before Helen could respond, a tall, thin man in a tailored blue blazer appeared at her elbow. He had a glass of champagne in one hand and a look of supreme self-assurance that only comes from never having had a bank transaction declined. Ah, the sister, he said, his voice carrying the easy, loud cadence of a man who believed the room was always listening to him. Maya, right? Julian's been telling me about your work. Very noble, very green. We're actually looking at some wetlands mitigation for the New Valley subdivision. We need someone to sign off on the drainage permits so we can start grading the lower meadow. This was Julian's father, Richard. He was the principal investor in the residential development Maya had spent the last 6 months opposing in her environmental impact reports. The lower meadow is an active flood basin, Richard, Maya said, her voice remaining professional but turning cold. If you grade it, you'll displace 40,000 cubic yards of water. During the winter rains, that water will have nowhere to go but into the basements of the existing homes. Downslope. Oh, the engineers have a plan for that, Richard said, waving his hand dismissively. A retention pond. Quite simple. Just a matter of moving some dirt and getting the agency to stamp the papers. We find that with the right encouragement, these regulatory hurdles tend to clear up. Some hurdles are there to keep people from drowning, Richard, Maya said. The circle of guests around us went quiet. Helen's smile tightened. Vivian looked annoyed. Richard laughed, but it was a dry, dismissive sound. Always the idealist, Maya. It's charming, really. But in the real world, we need growth. We can't let a few rare frogs stop a $50 million project. He looked at me, as if expecting me to join in his amusement. You're in business, Luke, right? You understand. Time is money. You can't let sentimentality get in the way of a clean cut. I looked at Richard. I looked at his polished shoes, his expensive blazer in the champagne glass that was shaking slightly because he had already had 3 of them. Then I looked at Maya. Her jaw was set, her eyes bright with the anger she was forcing herself to contain. Actually, Richard, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the small silence that had settled around us. In my business, if you don't pay attention to the grain of the wood before you cut, the whole piece splits. You can't force oak to do what it doesn't want to do with encouragement. If you try to build a foundation on wet soil without respecting the water, the house will slide. That's not sentimentality. That's physics. Richard's laugh died in his throat. He stared at me, his glass frozen halfway to his mouth. And as for Maya's work, I continued, my voice calm, steady, and utterly without heat. She isn't protecting frogs, Richard. She's protecting the valley's water table. If you pollute that basin, the vineyards you're standing on right now won't have usable water in 10 years. Her work is the only reason this valley still has a business to grow. The silence in the room was absolute now. The only sound was the crackle of the wood fire behind us. Maya looked up at me. Her eyes were wide, her expression a mix of shock and something else, something warm, deep, and completely unforced. Helen Estepon cleared her throat, her fan clicking shut with a sharp, decisive snap. Well, she said, her voice smooth as silk, it seems we have some very passionate minds at the table tonight. Come, Richard, let me introduce you to the senator's wife. She was asking about your development. As the group moved away, Vivian gave us one last, lingering look before following her mother. We were left alone near the fireplace. Maya let go of my hand, but only so she could step closer to me. She looked up, her breathing slightly fast. You just told my sister's father-in-law that his engineering plan was a physics failure, she whispered. I told him the truth, I said. He was talking about wood like it's plastic and soil like it's concrete. It annoyed me. It was perfect, she said, her voice dropping, becoming soft and thick with emotion. No one has ever stood there and said that to them. They always just look at me like I'm a nuisance. You're not a nuisance, Maya, I said, looking down at her. You're the smartest person in this room. They're just too busy looking at their own reflections to notice. She stared at me for a long moment, her hand rising slightly as if she were going to touch my lapel. Then she caught herself. The boundary we had set was still there, invisible but real, stretching between us like a thin wire. Come on, she said softly, her eyes dropping to my tie. Let's find our cabin. Before my mother figures out a way to have us seated at the children's table. The guest cabins at the Blackwood estate were small, luxury stone cottages scattered along the edge of the vineyard, surrounded by wild rosemary and ancient olive trees. Ours was cabin 4. Inside, the air was warm, smelling of cedar wood and dry linen. A single queen-sized bed dominated the main room, covered in a heavy white duvet. In the corner sat a small wood-burning stove, already laid with kindling and oak logs. A heavy timber screen divided the sleeping area from a small sitting space with 2 leather armchairs and a low oak table. One bed, I said, setting our bags down on the floor. Maya paused, her coat half unbuttoned. She looked at the bed, then at me. The coordinator told me they were fully booked. I thought they'd have a pull-out sofa. They don't, I said, walking over to the wood stove and checking the flue. But it's fine. I have my field sleeping pad in my truck. I can bring it in. Don't be ridiculous, Luke, Maya said, her voice practical, returning to her familiar nonsense tone. It's freezing outside, and you're too big for a camping pad on a stone floor. The bed is huge. We can split it. We've shared a tent before. We shared a tent when we were 12, Maya, I said, striking a match and holding it to the kindling. The paper caught yellow flames, climbing quickly through the dry oak twigs. You had a sleeping bag shaped like a caterpillar, and I had a cold. And we survived, she said, stepping over to the leather chair and dropping her satchel onto the floor. She sat down, pulling her boots off with a small sigh of relief. Besides, if my mother's spies see you carrying a sleeping pad out of your truck in the middle of the night, the story is dead. We have to keep up appearances, remember? Only if you promise not to complain about my snoring, I said, turning back to her. You don't snore, she said softly. You just breathe loudly, like a large, contented dog. Thank you, I said. That's the most poetic thing you've ever said to me, she laughed. A real clear sound that seemed to chase the lingering tension of the lobby out of the cabin. She leaned her head back against the leather of the chair, her eyes closed, her face illuminated by the warm orange glow of the wood stove. My mother is going to try to corner you tomorrow, she said after a minute. During the vineyard tour, she'll want to know about your family, your business plan, your long-term intentions. My intentions are to finish that white oak table by Tuesday, I said, sitting in the chair opposite hers. I'm serious, Luke, she said, opening her eyes and looking at me through the firelight. She doesn't understand people who make things. She thinks craftsman is a polite word for unemployed. She'll try to offer you a connection or a loan to see if you take the bait. I don't take bait, I said, and I don't need a loan. My shop is paid for, my tools are mine, and my wood comes from sustainable local lots. I don't owe anyone a dime, Maya. That's why I can sleep at night. She looked at me, her gaze steady, searching my face. I know. That's why I wanted you here. You're the only person I know who is completely complete. You don't need their approval. You don't even want it. I want your approval, I said quietly. The words came out before I could stop them. They weren't part of the script. They weren't part of the fake relationship we had spent 3 hours rehearsing in the truck. They were just true. Maya's breath caught. She didn't look away. The silence between us became thick, warm, and heavy, with 15 years of shared history, of quiet support, of things we had never said because the timing was never right, or because we were too afraid of losing the one stable thing we both had. You have that, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You've always had that, Luke. I stood up, the wood stove popping behind me, throwing a shower of tiny sparks against the iron screen. I'm going to get my dry shirt from the truck, and then we should get some sleep. Tomorrow is a long day, Luke, she called softly, as my hand touched the brass handle of the cabin door. I stopped, looking back over my shoulder. Thank you, she said, for what you said to Richard. It meant more than you think. You don't have to thank me for telling the truth, Maya, I said. And then I went out into the cold valley night. Day 2 was for the rehearsals, the formal luncheons, and the endless slow walks through the vineyard. The valley was beautiful under a high, pale sun that did nothing to warm the air. The grape leaves had turned a deep, dusty gold, falling in dry drifts between the rows of vines. Maya's mother, Helen, had indeed organized a private carriage tour of the estate for the family and close friends. Since I was currently holding Maya's hand and wearing a wool sweater that matched the dark forest green of her coat, I was included. We're very proud of the Blackwood selection, Helen said as the carriage moved slowly along the ridge trail. She was sitting opposite us, her silver-tipped cane resting between her knees. Vivian's wedding will be featured in the regional registry. It's a very important step for Julian's family. They're expanding their real estate portfolio into the Southern Hills. The Southern Hills are a protected nesting ground for the golden eagle, Mrs. Estepone, Maya said, her voice calm but firm. Vivian, who was sitting next to her fiancé. Julian sighed dramatically. Maya, please. Can we have one afternoon where we don't discuss the local fauna? It's my wedding weekend. It's just a matter of balance, Vivian, Julian said, his voice smooth, pacifying. He was a handsome man, but there was a softness to his jaw that suggested he had never had to defend an opinion in his life. The developers are setting aside 10% of the land for a green space. It's very progressive. 10% of a fragmented habitat is just a scenic cemetery, Julian, Maya said. Helen's eyes shifted to me. And what do you think, Luke? Do you agree with Maya's uncompromising views? Or do you see the value in a well-planned development? Maya's grip on my hand tightened. I could feel her fingers cold against mine. I think a tree takes 80 years to grow its first strong limb, Mrs. Estepone, I said, my voice carrying clearly over the rumble of the carriage wheels. And a bulldozer can take it down in 80 seconds. Once you clear that hill, you don't get it back. You can call it progressive, but from where I stand, it looks like a bad trade. You're trading a permanent resource for a temporary profit. Helen's eyes narrowed. You speak like a man who doesn't believe in progress. I believe in progress that lasts, I said. If I build a chair, I want it to be used by my grandchildren. If your development slides down the hill during the first heavy rain because the tree roots aren't there to hold the soil, that's not progress. That's just a liability. You've passed on to someone else. Julian looked uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and looked out at the vines. Vivian glared at Maya, who was currently looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated pride. Well, Helen said, her voice turning cold as ice, it's clear you two have spent a great deal of time aligning your perspectives. We have, Maya said, her voice steady, her eyes locking onto her mother's. Luke and I don't agree on everything. He thinks my coffee is too sweet, and I think he spends too much time talking to his wood. But we agree on what matters. We agree on what's real. She turned her head and looked at me, and for a second the entire vineyard, the carriage, her family, and the valley vanished. There was only her. Yes, I said softly, my hand turning to lace my fingers through hers. We do. The rehearsal dinner was held in the estate's private cellar, a long, stone-vaulted room 30 feet beneath the ground, lined with oak aging barrels and lit by hundreds of white candles. The air was cool, damp, and smelled of fermenting grapes, old wood, and beeswax. I sat next to Maya at the long timber table. Across from us sat Vivienne and Julian, flanked by his parents. Helen sat at the head of the table, presiding over the meal like a queen in her court. The wine was poured, the food was served, and the conversation turned to the wedding ceremony. The ceremony will be held in the lower pavilion, Vivienne said, her voice high and excited. We have a custom-built floral arch coming from the city. It's made of imported white birch. Birch? I asked, looking up from my plate. Yes, Vivienne said, looking pleased with herself. It's very rustic. It's 600 miles of transport, but it's the exact aesthetic I wanted. White birch is a softwood, Vivienne, I said, keeping my voice conversational. And it's green. If they cut it recently to build the arch, it's going to be heavy and full of moisture. If the weather stays damp like this, the joints will swell and loosen. Oh, I'm sure the florists know what they're doing, Luke, Helen said, her tone dismissive. They do these events all the time. I'm sure they do, I said. But they don't know the sheer strength of green timber. If the wind comes up off the ridge tomorrow, like the models are predicting, that arch is going to act like a sail. If it isn't anchored into the ground with steel pegs, it'll tip. You're being incredibly dramatic, Vivienne said, her voice rising. It's a beautiful arch. It's not going to tip. I'm just looking at the structure, Vivienne, I said, my voice calm, steady, and completely reasonable. If you build something that is top-heavy with soft wood, you're betting against gravity. Gravity always wins. Maya let out a tiny, soft laugh into her wine glass. Let's hope gravity behaves itself tomorrow, then. Julian's father, Richard, said, though he didn't look at me. He had spent the entire meal avoiding my eyes. After dinner, the guests began to drift back toward the main lodge for drinks. Maya and I walked slowly along the stone path toward our cabin. The rain had stopped, but the fog had rolled in from the river, thick and white, swallowing the base of the grapevines and making the estate look like an island floating in a sea of cloud. My sister is going to hate you if that arch stays standing tomorrow, Maya said. Her arms slipped through mine as we walked. I don't mind if she hates me, I said. As long as she doesn't get hit by 600 pounds of wet birch during the vows. You really can't help yourself, can you? She asked, her voice soft, teasing. You see, a structural flaw, and you have to name it. It's a habit, I admitted. If you don't name the flaw when you see it, you're the one who has to fix it when it breaks. We reached the porch of cabin 4. The wood stove inside had died down to a bed of glowing red coals, throwing a warm, soft light through the glass door. Maya didn't open the door. She stood on the porch, her back against the rough stone wall, her face half hidden in the shadow of the overhang. My mother asked me about you today, she said quietly. While you were helping the valet start your truck, I stepped closer to her, my boots clicking softly on the wet wood of the porch. What did she want to know? She asked me if we were serious. And what did you tell her? I told her we were, Maya whispered. I told her that you were the only man who had ever looked at my life and saw something worth protecting. I told her that I loved you. The word hung in the cold air between us, vibrating like a plucked string. "Maya," I said, my voice dropping, becoming thicker, rougher. "I had to say it, Luke," she said, her eyes rising to mine, shining in the dark. "To make it convincing. That's what we agreed, right? To make it look real." Her lips were slightly parted, her breath coming in tiny pale clouds that vanished in the fog. I could smell the cold rain on her skin, the sweet lavender of her hair, and the faint, clean scent of the pine forest. The boundary was gone. It hadn't broken, it had simply dissolved, like salt in water, leaving behind nothing but the truth we had been hiding from for 15 years. "Maya," I said again, my hand rising, my fingers brushing against the cold skin of her cheek. "I don't think we're playing the part anymore." "I don't think we are either," she whispered. I leaned down. My mouth found hers, and the kiss was nothing like a rehearsal. It was slow, deep, and heavy, with the weight of all the years we had spent waiting, of all the times I had watched her walk away, and all the times she had looked back. Her hands came up, her fingers tangling in the wool of my sweater, pulling me closer, her body warm against mine in the cold mountain air. When I finally pulled back, her forehead rested against mine, her breathing shallow, her eyes closed. "No regret clause?" I asked, my voice a low rumble. A small, breathless laugh escaped her. "Only if you promise to never put 3 sugars in my coffee again." "I can't promise that," I said, my thumb tracing her jawline. "Some things need to be sweet." The wedding day arrived with a gray, heavy sky and a wind that swept down from the ridge, rattling the dry grape leaves and making the canvas walls of the reception tents billow like sails. By noon, the guests had gathered in the lower pavilion. I stood next to Maya on the gravel path, watching the final preparations. The custom-built floral arch was indeed beautiful, a massive 600-pound structure of white birch branches, covered in trailing white roses and ivy. But as I had predicted, the wood was green, heavy, and the joints had begun to slip in the damp air. The wind off the ridge was catching the top of the arch, making the entire structure shudder and lean toward the front row of seating. "It's going to go," I murmured to Maya. "Luke, don't," she whispered, though her eyes were wide with worry. Vivienne is already on her 3rd glass of champagne. The head florist was standing near the arch, looking panicked as the left leg lifted half an inch from the grass. "I'll be right back," I said. I walked down the path, my suit jacket unbuttoned, my hands in my pockets. I stopped next to the florist, a young woman who looked like she was about to cry. "The joint in the upper left corner is slipping," I said quietly. "It's green wood. The fiber is too soft to hold the wood screws under this kind of lateral wind load." She looked at me, her eyes wild. "We don't have another arch. The bride is coming down the path in 10 minutes. "We don't need another arch," I said. "We just need some leverage." I walked back to my truck, which was parked near the service gate in the toolbox. Behind the cab, I had my heavy-duty ratcheting tie-downs, 3 steel rebar stakes, and my timber mallet. When I came back down the path, carrying the steel and the straps, Helen Estepone stopped me. "Luke, what on earth are you doing with that construction gear?" she demanded. "I'm keeping your daughter's wedding from becoming an emergency room statistic, Mrs. Estepone," I said, not slowing down. I walked under the arch. The florist watched as I drove the first steel stake deep into the gravel slope behind the left leg, tilting the hammer so the stake caught the hard subsoil beneath. I ran a heavy green paracord strap, the kind I used to secure timber loads on my truck, through the main junction of the birch branches, cinched it tight, and anchored it to the steel. I did the same on the right side, creating a perfect triangle anchor that held the heavy structure in a steady, unyielding grip against the wind. The green straps were invisible behind the thick trailing ivy and roses, but the arch didn't move an inch, even when a 30-mile-per-hour gust rolled down the slope. I drove the last stake, wiped the mud from my hands with a clean rag from my pocket, and stepped back. The florist looked at me like I had just performed a miracle. "Thank you," she breathed. "Oh my God, thank you." "Just check the tension after the vows," I said. "Wood moves when it's wet." As I walked back to Maya, Helen was standing on the path, her silver-tipped cane resting on the gravel. She looked at the arch, then at the steel stakes, and finally at me. "You're an incredibly stubborn man, Luke," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. "I am Mrs. Estepone," I said, stopping beside Maya. "But so is your daughter. That's why we work so well together." Helen stared at us for a long, silent moment. Then she let out a quiet sigh, her fan clicking shut. "Well, at least the arch is straight. Come along, Maya. It's time for the procession." The ceremony was beautiful. The vows were said, and the birch arch held perfectly against the wind. At the reception inside the Grand Lodge, the atmosphere was different. The passive-aggressive comments had stopped. Richard didn't discuss his development project with us, and Vivian actually stopped by our table to hand me a glass of the estate's reserve Cabernet. "The arch looked very stable, Luke," she said, her eyes dropping to her plate before she looked up at me. "Thank you." "It was my pleasure, Vivienne," I said. "Congratulations." As she walked away, Maya leaned her head against my shoulder, her fingers laced through mine under the table. "My sister just thanked you," she murmured. "I think the world might actually be ending." "It's not ending," I said, looking down at her. "It's just adjusting its structure." The dinner ended, the toasts were made, and by midnight, the guests had begun to drift back to their rooms. Maya and I walked slowly back to cabin 4. The fog had lifted, revealing a sky full of cold, bright stars that looked like salt thrown across a black velvet cloth. We stood on the porch, looking out over the quiet vineyards. "Tomorrow we drive back," Maya said quietly. "We do," I said. "I have a white oak table to finish, and you have a wetlands report to submit." "And the boundaries?" she asked, her eyes rising to mine, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "The boundaries have been completely redesigned," I said, my hands finding her waist, pulling her closer to me in the dark. "The old structure was non-compliant. It had a severe flaw in the foundation." "What flaw?" "It didn't have you in it," I said. She laughed, and the sound carried across the quiet vineyard, bright, alive, and completely real. We went inside, and this time we didn't worry about the space between the chairs. We didn't worry about the story we were telling her family, or the one we had been telling ourselves for 15 years. The next morning, the valley was clean and bright under a hard blue sky. I loaded our bags into the back of my truck, checking the tie-downs one last time before I climbed into the cab. Maya sat in the passenger seat, her boots resting on the dashboard, her tablet in her lap. As we pulled out of the stone gates of the Blackwood estate, my truck's diesel engine rumbled loudly. Scattering the gravel and making the valet look up from his podium, Maya looked back at the grand stone manor, then at me. "You know," she said, her voice soft content, "my mother is still going to think you're rustic." "I am rustic," I said, keeping my eyes on the winding mountain road. "But my structures hold, Maya. That's the difference." "I know," she said, reaching over and lacing her fingers through mine. "That's exactly why I kept you." The road ahead was long, winding down through the golden hills and back toward the forest where the white oak was waiting. The wood was still stubborn, but I knew exactly where to make the cut. Now the alignment was perfect. Core lesson: real partnership doesn't require a perfect high-profile presentation to survive the storm. It just requires two people who are willing to stand firm, tell the truth, and anchor each other when the wind off the ridge begins to blow. When someone respects your work, your boundaries, and your choices under pressure, the boundaries you built to protect yourself are finally ready to be redrawn. Thank you for listening to our story. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories of genuine connection, respect, and the quiet strength of love that holds when the world tries to shake it down. See you in the next story.